Today we talk to Warren Davis. He designed and programmed the original Cubert arcade game, worked, for example, for Gottlieb Williams and Midway, and developed a video digitation system that was used on arcade games like Mortal Kombat. Later he worked for Disney and was involved in the production of a Spyro game too. Welcome to our podcast. Hi, Warren Davis.
Hello there. It's very nice to be here with you.
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. Do you remember your first contacts with computers, with computer technology?
Um, yeah, I remember seeing them on television because when I was young, computers were the size of a room. So I remember, always seeing in like those 1950s science fiction movies that they would show on television when I was a kid. These computers would be big rooms full of boxes with spinning wheels and tape drives and hums, and they could do miraculous things. And I just fell in love with computers from that.
And what was the first computer you owned by yourself?
Well, the first computer I used, I'm gonna because that's earlier. I didn't own a computer. Quite honestly, I didn't own a computer until after I was already. Well, let me see. Wait, let me think about this. Did I own one when I worked for Bell Labs? I don't think so. I think I didn't own a computer until I was already working for Gottlieb making video games. But um, my first experience with computers was in high school, which was sort of unusual because not too many, computers were not widespread. By the time I was in high school, some of them had gone down from the size of a room to the size of a desk.
Mhm.
But my computer had a desk size computer. I don't know where they got it from. And I jumped at the opportunity to learn about it, and I eventually became in charge of it. I was actually the head of my computer room in high school, and that was called the Monrobot 11 computer. It had a typewriter, didn't have a CRT screen, and it had a paper tape drive, a paper tape with holes in it. Every row had up to 8 holes punched, and that's how it could read in or punch out something to save. So yeah, very crude by today's standards, but that was my first computer that I got to learn and use. I didn't own one until later, and I owned the first one I owned was made by AT&T, and it was just basically an IBM PC clone made by AT&T with a four color monitor. I didn't buy one when they were just black and white. I waited till they were at least 4 colors.
What was the first game you remember? The first game you saw, and or the first game you played?
I assume you're talking about video games,
Yes.
because we go a lot back earlier with board games and pinball, but yeah, I believe it was Pong. It was either Pong or Computer Space.
Okay, they were the
Those were the
first
two.
games, yeah.
They were, I mean, because basically, I remember 1973, I was a freshman in college, and we had a game room. And it was all, mostly they had bowling alleys on one side and ping pong tables and pool tables on the other, excuse me, on the other side. And they had a small arcade that had pinball machines and some of those old electromechanical games. Um, and I remember them wheeling in some video games. They were the first video games, and I was just absolutely captivated. It was just like nothing I'd ever seen before, and they just grabbed me instantly.
At what time you thought about programming such things?
Well, I was in college at the time studying computer engineering, so I was immediately interested, but I didn't understand enough about these new machines to understand what it even would take. I didn't know what kind of knowledge I would need in order to program them. I certainly didn't know anything about computer graphics just because there was so, little of it being done. And my university was very theoretical, so you didn't get a lot of hands-on opportunities. Um, But yeah, I was immediately interested, and it then became my dream to be able to program video games. I just didn't know how to make that dream happen.
Your environment, your friends, your family, did they understand what you are doing there? Did they understand this new technique?
Not particularly. I mean, they you know, I don't think my friends and family, other than the friends who I was at school with, but my friends and family back home, uh, they didn't understand computers, but they certainly supported me learning about them, because my career path when I was in high school, I had a choice to make of what I wanted to study, and my two choices were either computers or filmmaking. So I think they were very happy that I chose computers and not filmmaking.
At what time you thought this will be your job in the future? Was there a special time, a special moment?
Um, I'm not. Well, let me make sure I understand the question. You're asking if there was a time when I felt I would do this for a living?
Yeah, yeah.
Not really. I just didn't know how you got in. Maybe I was naive. Maybe I was just ignorant. I don't know. But I just didn't, I couldn't see myself just walking up to the door at one of these companies and saying, "Hey, I'd like to have a job." It just somehow that didn't seem like a possibility. And it wasn't until I had actually decided to leave engineering. I'd worked for Bell Labs after college for 3 years, and I was a little disillusioned with the life of an engineer. It wasn't what I expected it to be. I wasn't doing the sort of work I wanted to do, and I thought of leaving, and I actually was started to make a move towards becoming an improvisation comic by doing improv comedy at Second City in Chicago. Uh, and then by chance, I would look at the Sunday classified ads, and one day there was an ad. Gottlieb was looking to hire video game programmers, and I was absolutely stunned that I saw that, and I thought about it, which is even crazier. I didn't jump at it. I had to think about it a while, but I did apply for the job, and I got the job, and that changed my life.
That were the early 80s. Tell us something about the company Gottlieb, your way to Gottlieb.
Yeah. So Gottlieb was a family-owned business for many years, started in the 1920s, known as a pinball company. Pinball, of course, over the decades had its ups and downs, and I think they were very good at weathering those down periods. They knew exactly how to survive in those down periods. But with this whole video game craze starting, a lot of the pinball companies were jumping on to making video games, and Gottlieb was one of the last ones to do that. Um, Also, a few years before I came on board, they were sold. The family sold the business to Columbia Pictures, so it was no longer a family-run company. It was had a corporate overlord, if you will. But I don't think that affected me in any way, because the company itself was run the same way it always had been. But when they decided to get into video, their video department was fairly new. I think it was maybe a year old when I came on board, and they had done a couple of things. They had created a video system to put into a pinball machine. So this pinball was called Caveman, and it's a pinball machine with a video monitor in it, and you take time out of your pinball game to play a little video game. And they also they hired Tim Skelly, who was a famous in the world of video games designer, and he had worked for Cinematronics and had a whole bunch of hit games, and they hired him away to sort of start up our company, or I would say sort of lead the video department creatively, and inspire, well, actually, mostly they wanted him to make a game. But I think as a side thing, they had him as a mentor to all of us sort of fledgling newcomers to the industry. And that, he I've certainly learned a lot from him, and looking at his code and talking with him. But he was making the game Reactor. So Reactor was sort of in its final stages of being tweaked when I came on board. Um, and the other thing that was interesting about Gottlieb back in those days is that we were completely separate from the pinball division. So, wisely or not, Gottlieb decided to start up this video division in a separate location. So it was a very small group, and we were nowhere near the pinball operation. I mean, I don't even think I saw, I don't think I've ever visited that plant um, until we actually moved in there. There was a point about 6 months into 1982 or so where I literally was in the middle of developing Qbert, and that's when they merged us and they brought us back from the separate location into the main location.
Um,
So yeah, it was an interesting time. It was very much of a small group, a think tank kind of mentality where it's very loose. We were encouraged to just follow our ideas. There was no structure really. Our VP of business development, Howie Rubin, was a nut. He would come in the middle of the day and he'd say, "All right, everybody, stop working. We're going down on the plant. We're going to play football." And he would make us go down and toss a football around for a little while in this big empty plant because they had this huge manufacturing facility that wasn't being used. It was waiting for its first game at the time. So yeah, it was a really, really interesting time.
and what was the first game you worked on? I read about a never released superhero game. Was that the first, or were there other games before Qbert?
The only game I worked on before Qbert was an unreleased game. The lead programmer on it was Tom Malinowski, and it was recently resurrected and released, or at least one cabinet was released, and they called it Argus. The game originally was it went through many versions and many names, but it's basically a superhero game. It was inspired by the movie Superman 2, where Superman battles 3 Kryptonian villains. And they kept putting it. So my part of it was very small. I just did some supplemental programming. The basic idea of the game is Superman is trying to protect little pedestrians that are walking along the bottom of the screen. And the Kryptonian villains keep knocking into each other. And when they knock into a building, pieces of rubble fall to the ground. And sometimes pedestrians get killed. So my job was to program a bulldozer that would come out from the side of the screen and push all of the rubble off screen so it didn't accumulate. And other than and I also wrote, I believe, the diagnostics, the operator diagnostics that a player would never see. I wrote that package, but that was the extent of my contribution to that game, which went by many names: Protector, Guardian, Video Man, and finally Argus. And it was recently released. Jeff Lee, the artist that I worked with on Qbert, and he was the artist for this game. And he and Tom somehow got it put together with the help of Doc Mack, who runs a place called the Galloping Ghost Arcade in outside of Chicago.
And then there was Qbert. Who had the idea and how did that start?
Well, so after I was done with this, well, I called it ProVidGuard Argus, which is a combination of all of its names. So when I was done with ProVidGuard Argus, basically my mandate was to make a game. Ron Waxman was our VP of engineering. Howie Rubin was our VP of business development. They ran the department and they just gave me free rein. Okay, make us a game. So I still felt like I had things to learn. And so I wanted to do some experimenting. One day, another one of our programmers, Kan Yabamoto, who is probably best known for making the game Mad Planets, he was experimenting with foreground and background planes, and we had a little switch on our hardware that would let us swap the foreground and background. And anyway, just as a random background screen, Jeff Lee had created a pattern of cubes that filled the screen, that sort of Escher-like optical illusion, because it took very few background blocks. I think there were only like 6 background blocks that repeated to fill the entire screen. But when I saw that, I was fascinated by it. And I thought, oh, that's really interesting, because if you shaped that into the shape of a pyramid with like one cube, then two, then three, then four, and then if something fell and bounced on the top, it would have one of two ways to bounce. It could bounce down to the left or bounce down to the right. And programmers like binary. It's a nice concept for them. And since about 7 rows would fit on a screen, that meant in a single random byte, I could define a pattern for a ball that was falling. And that's all I needed. So I started as a programming exercise to program a ball bouncing down a pyramid of cubes for no purpose. There was no game. It was literally just a programming exercise. And that's how it got started.
And that's why it's called Qbert, or because of the cubes.
Yes, the cube. Yes, and of course the name came much later. The name didn't come until the game was pretty much completed. I just called it the Cubes game as I was developing it. But we realized at the end of the cycle we couldn't release it without a name, and everybody seemed to think that we should name the character, or everybody seemed to think the name of the game should be the name of the character, because the character, thanks to Jeff Lee's amazing graphic artwork, it had such personality. So we had a meeting to decide what the name of the character would be, and yes, it evolved into Qbert, and yes, the cube part of Qbert came from the cubes.
The title character is an orange square with legs, eyes, and a trumpet-shaped mouth. Why?
Well, that's more of a question for Jeff Lee, but Jeff's original intention was that he would shoot something out of his nose. I mean, that was the idea. And while I appreciated that idea and I thought it would be hysterical and fantastic, I was just not feeling adept enough to accomplish that in the limited resources that I had and my limited experience as a programmer. So I asked him if I could use that character. By the way, the character was designed, all the characters were designed before the game. When it came time for me to start putting characters into this thing that was evolving into a game, I asked Jeff if he had characters lying around, and he did. He put them all up on the screen, and I picked the orange one with the big nose, even though I had no desire to use his nose in the game.
If there is a person who did not play Qbert in her life, how would you describe the game in short words?
Wow, let's see. I'd say it's a game where you have to change the tops of all the cubes on the playfield to the same color. And the key strategy, I would say, is that occasionally it's best not to move. It's best to sit and wait sometimes. That's all. And they're on their own.
Of course. The other thing what's interesting is Qbert has an incomprehensible language with speech bubbles and symbols. Was it why that?
So this came from our sound designer, Dave Thiel. When I looked back at the project at the end, I always believed that Qbert was a production by the three of us. I called us the Qbert Triumvirate. It was Dave Thiel, Jeff Lee, and myself. So Dave did the sounds, all the sounds for the game. And when it came to Qbert's speech, he had this amazing idea. We had a speech chip called the Votrax, and it was capable of making speech. It had phonemes built in, and you would string together the phonemes to create speech, but it sounded just horrible. It was mechanical. It was just, sometimes hard to understand. And Dave absolutely hated it. He had to use it on some pinball machines and he just hated it. But he thought, well, what if I throw random numbers at it? So basically random phonemes are coming out. And when he did that, it just sounded like gibberish. And he thought that's that's perfect for Qbert. And he was right. It was perfect.
Qbert was converted to a lot of different systems. Were you involved in other systems too?
Say again, I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Okay, Qbert was converted to a lot of different systems, home computers, and so on. Were you involved in that productions too?
Oh, no, not, well, only marginally. I do remember getting phone calls from some of the developers because we farmed that development out to other companies. I remember, I think it was Parker Brothers had the license, and so they took care of all that. But I do remember putting together some documents, just explaining sort of the level progressions and the tuning tables, and sending that off to the people who were doing the ports. And I also remember a couple of phone conversations with people who had some questions. But other than that, I really had absolutely nothing to do with any of the ports.
Was the game successful from the beginning?
It was, yes, surprisingly to me, since it was my first game, really. Yeah, well, the way we would test games is we'd put them in arcades, usually without fanfare. They would just show, in one arcade, a game would just show up. And back at that time, that wasn't uncommon for players to see new games. And we would leave them there for a few weeks and just see how much money they collected. And that was basically what we called a coin test. And that was, really useful in selling the game to distributors. And, luckily Qbert did very well in the coin test from the get-go. We also would do things like focus groups, and I would also go to the arcade and watch people play it. And there, I was terrified because, sometimes people would just put in a quarter, jump right off the pyramid and die. And I thought, oh, that's not good. Especially since people in management were concerned about that. And they were saying, well, we don't think the player should die if you jump off the pyramid. And I would really fought back on that because I felt like, there should be some skill involved, and maneuvering around your playfield should be something a player should get skilled at. So I stuck to my guns on that one, but it turned out not to be a problem. People learned quickly, and then they wouldn't jump off the pyramid, and it all worked out.
Did you ever thought at that days that you would talk about Qbert 40 years later?
Absolutely not. No, absolutely not. I was very gratified that it was successful. It helped me in my career. I mean, basically, having had a successful game, I was able to sort of explore any ideas that I had and work on any project I wanted to at Gottlieb. And then when I moved over to Williams, I was sort of starting back at square one, but my reputation with Qbert definitely preceded me. So, I was always very grateful for it. But I think all of us back then just expected that, these games had a very short shelf life. People were going to play them. Then the next good game is going to come up and they're going to just forget about them. So the nostalgia for all of these games took me really by surprise. And it started in the mid 90s. That's when I first started getting word that people were remembering the old games, and people, were asking me questions or sending me emails, and yeah, it just floored me. And then the whole growth of the retro gaming conventions all over the world. It's absolutely phenomenal. Amazing.
Yeah, and Qbert has a cameo appearance in the feature film Ralph Reichts, and of course in Pixels, and he was in an episode from The Simpsons too. What do you think about that appearances?
Again, very gratifying. Even earlier than that, years ago, he appeared in a movie called Moscow on the Hudson with Robin Williams. And that was a shock. I didn't know anything about that. I was watching that movie in a theater just like anybody else, and all of a sudden Qbert appeared on the screen. So yeah, his impact on popular culture was just never expected. And he has kind of faded. He didn't maintain the popularity of, say, Donkey Kong or Pac-Man, but there's a core group of people that are just, really adamant about their love for Qbert. And then, there are the people who are in the industry now, and that's how he got into things like Pixels and Wreck-It Ralph, which is fantastic. I'm so glad the character is still having a life.
2 years later, there was a game, Us versus Them. What was that for sort of game?
Yeah, that was I enjoyed working on that so much. That was a Laserdisc game, which was something, I guess you could call it a fad, only because it had a sort of tragic ending and a short-lived lifespan. But there were time when Dragon's Lair came out, and it basically was an interactive cartoon with a being with the film was played on a laser disc, and you just had to sort of push your joystick in a direction at the right time to advance. And then a number of companies started experimenting with using laserdisc footage as a background and overlaying computer graphics on top of that. And that's what we did at Gottlieb. And we came out first with Mach 3, which was a huge success. And they said, well, let's do another one. And specifically, they wanted something that could be a kit, something that, when Mach 3 started, when the earnings started to fall on Mach 3, people could buy a kit and turn it into a new game very quickly and cheaply. And that's where the genesis of Us versus Them came. The idea actually came from Dennis Nordman, who was working at Gottlieb at the time. Now he's, a legendary pinball designer for many years. But back then he was doing just game design. And he worked with Rich Tracy, who was our art director, and a guy named Dave. Oh my God, now I'm blanking on his name. But they sort of came up with the concept, Dennis mostly, but they came up with the concept, and they came to me and said, are you interested in this idea we have for sort of a science fiction B movie alien invasion game? And I was really excited about that concept. So I jumped on board, and then we developed it together.
And then you went to Williams. And was Gottlieb closed, or what was the problem?
Yeah, so it's kind of sad, but the whole bottom fell out of the industry. The Laserdisc games were found to be not really ready for arcade usage. They were using a Pioneer Laserdisc model inside of the cabinets, and if you hit the cabinet or shook the cabinet, it would skip, and then you'd lose sync, and then the game would crash, and people would get their money back, and the operators didn't like that, and this was happening all too much. So plus at the same time, there was a real influx. I mean, just everybody was jumping on the video game bandwagon, and there were a lot of just bad video games coming out. People were just looking for a cash grab, and so a lot of players were rejecting a lot of the games. They weren't earning. The arcades, so many arcades had opened up in the early 80s, and then suddenly they started going out of business. So there was a real crash of the whole video game industry in the mid 1980s. And around that time, Coca-Cola, who had bought Columbia Pictures, which owned Gottlieb, Coca-Cola decided to close us down. And so we were just shut down forever, which is very sad. Gottlieb had such a great history, and it had weathered so many downturns. I knew that they could have weathered some more. They made plenty of money off of Q*bert and Mach 3, which were both hits. Us versus Them would have been a huge hit, except for the fact that nobody suddenly, just when it was being released, nobody would buy a Laserdisc game because of the problems they had in the field. So just bad timing. Unfortunately, when it was out on test, it tested like number one for weeks and weeks. So we thought we had another hit on our hands, but nope. And then a few months later, Gottlieb closed their doors.
Yeah, at Williams, you work on the game Juice 2.
Yes.
Juice 2, yeah.
Yes, so I think I spent a little time at Williams working on some art tools. And then Joust 2, which was in development, Again, a sequel to the original Joust, which was designed and created by John Newcomer with a programmer named Bill Futzenreuter. And I guess Bill was off doing something in the pinball world. He was no longer doing video games. So John had a new programmer. And I guess that programmer is getting into some problems, falling behind schedule. And I guess his code wasn't up to snuff or whatever. But for whatever reasons, they let him go. And so the project had no programmer. So they called upon myself and Christina Donofrio, who is another programmer we had. And we took over and finished the game, Joust 2.
At Williams, you developed a video digitation system which was used on games such Mortal Kombat and others. Can you tell us something about that software or that system?
Sure. Yeah. Around that time, right after Joust 2, our hardware guy, Mark Lafredo, was starting to think about, well, maybe parts have become cheap enough that we could afford to have more than 16 colors, which was the industry standard. So he was thinking about developing a 256 color system. And my thought was, wow, 256 colors, that's, a lot more than we've ever had. Could we approach photorealism? Could we get sort of photographic quality? And so I started doing experimentation with video digitizers, which were very new, very clunky, very slow, but there was one for the Amiga computer, and I started playing around with it and learning algorithms and figuring things out. And it turned out it really wasn't anything that was practical at the time. But soon after, a group called True Vision came out with a series of digitizer boards. And one of them was called the Image Capture Board, and it just seemed to fit exactly what we needed. And so luckily, it came with a software development kit, which meant that it had the tools for me to write my own software to control it. And so that's what I did. So the first version of this, I call this software WTARG. And the first version of it was a little clunky, but it worked. And basically we could videotape, we could either point it at a still image and just do a live capture of something that wasn't moving. But if we wanted something moving, we had to basically videotape it and then freeze frame the videotape and then grab frozen still frames and digitize them. And then that would put them in a digital form that our artists could manipulate. And so that was the first use of the system. Eugene Jarvis was not working at Williams during those early days of digitization, but he came back and sort of came up with his own ideas for a 256 color system. And so my digitizing system got used for that first game, which was Narc.
And without this system, Mortal Kombat and other games would not have been that look that they had.
Yeah, that's correct. So, while Narc was being developed, John Newcomer and I were working on another game using digitized graphics. It didn't get released, but it looked phenomenal. And really, John built a lot of models of cars and trucks and houses and stores and created a suburban landscape, and it just looked photorealistic. It was amazing. Anyway, that game didn't get released. Shortly after that, I left William to create my own game system and another game for Premier Technologies. That's a whole other story. That game was called Exterminator, and that got released, but very, very small quantities. It's a very rare game. Although it was ported to some home systems, but that was a completely digitized background or a digitized system with both a foreground and a background capable of independent 256 colors. But a few years later, I was asked to come back to Williams to work on Terminator 2, which was in the middle of development. And I found that they were still using the exact same digitizing system I had left them with, where I thought somebody would, improve it. I thought somebody would continue to work on it, but nobody did. So I sort of made it my own goal to upgrade it and improve it, and I continued to do that for the rest of the time I was at Williams. Mortal Kombat 1, excuse me there. Mortal Kombat 1 used the original digitizing system that NARC used, but shortly after that, I added, features and made use of our hardware started to improve and made use of multiple palettes. So instead of a single 256 color palette, we had multiple 256 color palettes. And so I let, the software would make use of that and things like that. And so Mortal Kombat 2, has better graphics because of that, Mortal Kombat 3, etc. Yeah, and it was used on Revolution X, Terminator 2, many of the games that came out of in the early to mid 90s. It was also used to create a lot of the graphics and a lot of the textures for Cruis'n USA when that first came out, even though that was a 3D polygon system.
But you did not program all of these games. But Terminator 2, you were involved in programming too.
Yeah, Terminator 2, I was on the design team and was one of the programmers. George Petro was the lead programmer. Jack Hager was the lead artist. And we had one other programmer, Bill Dabblestein. And then we kept the same team together, more or less, for Revolution X. So those are the games I actually worked on and contributed to.
Did you work on other Qbert games, for example, on Qbert 3 in 1992, or were that other teams?
No, I never did. After Qbert, well, of course, we didn't talk about faster, harder, more challenging Qbert. That was basically done like immediately after I was done with Qbert. I started to worry that I'd made it too easy. The people at Gottlieb were pressuring me to make it easier all the time. They thought it was too hard. So I kept slowing things down and making it easy. And then I got reports back about people playing it for hours and hours and hours on a single quarter. And that really worried me. So I made faster, harder, more challenging Qbert as a response to that. And they put it out on test, but they never released it. So it was a dead project. And then after that, they said, well, do you want to do a sequel to Qbert? And do you want to do another Qbert? And I said no, because I really had many other things I wanted to do. I had other ideas I wanted to explore. And so another young junior programmer at Gottlieb named Neil Bernstein said, well, listen, I've got an idea for a Qbert game. Do you mind if I do it? And I said, no, not at all. Have at it. So Neil took over the reins and came up with Qbert's Cubes, which was released, although, again, not a huge success, but it was released and you can still find them today.
You mentioned Revolution X in 1994. Did your team met Aerosmith for that game?
Oh yeah, we digitized them in our blue screen studio. We had them for three, as I remembered, it was 3 13-hour days. The whole band was there at our disposal. George and Jack were directing them. Most of the team was working in some capacity on the shoot. I was the clapboard guy, clapping the little thing before every take. And they were amazing. They were amazing to work with. They were just so down to earth, very just, gracious and easy to work with and fun to be around. And then they gave us passes to one of their concerts a few months later. So they were great. I can't say how great they were to work with. They were phenomenal.
In short words, tell us your way to Disney, because in 1996 you moved to California and it ended in a game from the Spyro series.
Well, yes, circuitous route, but basically it's a fairly long story, but I left California very suddenly, or left Chicago for California very suddenly. I went from not expecting to go to being there within like a month. And I spent some exploratory time in California, just figuring out what to do with my life there. And It took a while. I mean, at first I had to think about buying a home. Did I want to move there? Because I have a family, you know? Did I want to bring my family there? And I was there for a few months, came back to Chicago for a few months. Then I was back to California, and I think that's when I made the decision I did want to move. And once I made that decision, I started looking for a job. And amongst all of the video game work, because there was a lot of video game work being done in California, I somehow latched on to Disney, found that they were looking for people and applied, and I was hired in February of 1996, even though I didn't start work until August, because first I was hired and then I had to go back to Chicago and move my family. So the logistics of it were odd. I bought a house in California and then sold my house in Chicago and then moved my family. And it was, yeah, it was probably the backwards way to do it, but somehow it all worked out. I was at Disney for 4 years. And during that time, there were constant layoffs. People were constantly being, every 6 months, they were just laying people off because the group I had gone to, Disney Interactive, was losing tons of money. They were run by these people who really didn't understand video games. And, I mean, it was just crazy, the money they were wasting. They probably had 600 people working there, none of whom were really producing video games. They were all designers and producers, and long stories there. But eventually they were fired, and a new person came in who was much more fiscally responsible. But the layoffs sort of continued. I don't know how I survived, but I survived years of layoffs. And then in 2000, I heard that I was not going to survive the next layoff, but they offered me a transfer. So I actually transferred from Disney Interactive to Walt Disney Imagineering, which was a dream of mine. I always admired the Imagineers. They create so many just amazing things, all the attractions at Disneyland, things like that. And I was very excited about being an Imagineer. Unfortunately, I was in a group called the VR Studio. It didn't stay in Imagineering for very long. It actually was moved into consumer products after I left, but I was only there for 4 months. I was not very happy there. And so I left after a few months, and that was the end of me in Disney. So Spyro, wow, Spyro happened because I took a job with a very small company called Check Six Studios, and they had just gotten the Spyro contract. The way I got in there was through a former colleague at Disney, so Disney did help me, I guess, get into that. But yeah, so that's how I got to Spyro from Disney.
I read about a game called Lunar Explorer in 2006. You were a project manager. Can you tell us something about that project?
Sure. Yeah. After Check Six, well, that's a whole long story, but from Check Six, I went to a company called Equinox, which used to be part of Check Six or working with Check Six. Anyway, then from Equinox, I went to a company called Virtuplay. And they had some really interesting technology, and it was capable of stereo, 3D stereo applications. And there was this really interesting project where they wanted to have a mapping of the moon. There are a lot of stories connected with this too, I could tell you, but strangely enough, we don't have that great data from the moon. All of the data we have from the moon is based on our 1970s trips to the moon, but we don't really have a great topological map of the moon. I think now we might have better data, and if not, they're planning missions to create better data. But when we were making this Lunar Explorer, we found out that we have better data. We had better data then for Mars than we did for the moon. So the resolution of the topological data was not very good. Although for the lunar landing sites, we did have very high resolution data. So what we were able to do is sort of, we did the best we could, I guess. But it was basically similar to Google Earth or Google Moon. I think Google has a product, you can go online and do a lot of what Lunar Explorer did. But of course, Google Moon didn't exist then. So that was basically what that was. It was a lot of fun to work on. I was very proud of it. And, it again didn't get a lot of marketing push. And I think that had to do with the company itself and, the way they were run. But I thought it was a decent product. It was an edutainment. It really wasn't a game. It was intended to be an educational product.
Is it correct that you work for Industrial Light and Magic too?
Yes, that was, 2008 to 2010. I left Virtue Play after Lunar Explorer. And I was just looking for a job, as is the case for any working stiff. And I saw there was an opening at Industrial Light and Magic, and the skill set that they were looking for looked like exactly my skill set. I was very excited. So I applied, and ILM is in San Francisco and I'm living in Los Angeles, but they were specifically looking for somebody who lived in Los Angeles because they were looking for basically a liaison. They had a piece of software they wanted studios in Los Angeles to use. And so they wanted a technical person in Los Angeles who could be the go-between between the development team up in San Francisco and the users in Los Angeles. That was the plan. It didn't exactly work out as they thought. They got a new CTO, and after a few months after I was hired, who said, "Yeah, we don't want our software to go out into other people's hands." So things changed, but I did stay there for 2 years. I enjoyed it tremendously. I loved everything about working there. I got to go up there about, for a few days every couple of months just to sort of check in and see people. And my goodness, what a fantastic place to work. It's like a museum. Everything, every hallway is like a museum as you walk around there. And, just getting to see advanced screenings of things that they're working on. It was just a mind-blowing, miraculous place to work while it lasted. And this was all before Disney bought it.
Some years ago, you were inducted into the International Video Game Hall of Fame. And what were your feelings about that?
Well, I was just, blown away at the request when they contacted me. It's not something I really was aware of, and knew anything about, but I thought, what an honor. So I was very, very gratified and happy to go out there. It was my first trip to Ottumwa, Iowa, which, the history of video games in Ottumwa, Iowa is enormous. Twin Galaxies, the birthplace of video game record keeping, run by Walter Day, who is iconic in the world of video games. So just getting to meet him was a treat, and all the people who run the organization are fantastic. David Crane was inducted the same year I was, and hanging out with him was a real treat. I'd never met him in my entire career. So, it's just a phenomenal honor. I was very grateful.
We talked about a lot of projects. Were there important projects I forgot? Important for you?
In what way do you mean important?
Successful or important for you in person?
I mean, I've always enjoyed everything I've worked on. I don't think I've ever worked on something that I didn't believe was in some way important. I think if you asked me what game I was most proud of, it'd probably be Us versus Them, because it was very unique. There was no other game at that time that was incorporating live action scenes with actors and a script, incorporating that with video gameplay. There had literally never been anything like that. And I think we got it to work very successfully. And And it's probably my biggest regret that the bottom fell out of the industry just as it was being released, because I really do think that would have been a hugely successful game.
What project, what game took the longest or the shortest production time?
Well, Qbert wasn't very long. It was pretty short. From the time, because as I said, it started out as just a programming exercise, but once it became a game, I think it was pretty much finished in about 4 to 5 months. And I'm trying to think, what's the longest game? What, things like Terminator 2, I was only there for the tail end of that, for about half of that. Revolution X, both, back then games then were taking, I'd say at least a year to be completed. I'm trying to think if I was ever, well, okay. So the game, probably the biggest disaster that I ever worked on was Spyro, the Spyro game. Again, I could talk forever. There are just so many stories about it, but it was not a successful or smooth development project, and probably took longer than most.
What was the most successful project in the end?
Well, I mean, given the longevity and the fact that you could still find them out there, I'd have to say Qbert by far the most successful thing. Terminator 2 is a close second. Terminator 2 was really, really successful when it came out, and I think is still remembered. And you again still see it in arcades even today. Revolution X is still, again, I mean, a lot of these games are still remembered. But Qbert and Terminator 2, I'd say definitely up there.
We had some examples where there were a lot of unpublished games. I read about a game for a console that was not released and such things. What were the unpublished games you remember?
Well, let's see. I guess there are three I could talk about. One was at Gottlieb. After Qbert and before Us versus Them, I was exploring some concepts, and one of them actually turned out to be pretty good, and people liked it. People who saw it liked it. People who played it liked it. And for whatever reason, I just couldn't finish it. I couldn't figure out the hook to make it a complete package, and I kind of let it go. And I think I regret that a little bit. It was a good concept, but I just didn't follow through. And I was in the middle of working on that when Us versus Them came along, and I always thought, oh, after Us versus Them, I'll go back to it, but I just never did. My working title for that was Bunny Bondage, and I wish I could explain why. They were rabbits. There were flying rabbits, and you had to deflect them with a shield. I have no idea where that came from, but and then let's see. After that, the unreleased game was when I was working at Williams, while Narc was being developed. I mentioned earlier, John Newcomer and I were working on this game that never got released, and that was called USSA, and it was supposed to be a blending of USA and USSR, because it was basically it was a Cold War, United States versus Russia. The Russians are coming to United States and attacking, and so they're driving tanks in our streets, and the Americans are driving 4x4 trucks with a missile launcher in the bed. And you drove your thing with a steering wheel, and then there were buttons on the steering wheel where you could launch a missile. And then after you launched the missile, you'd steer the missile with your steering wheel. I thought this was great. I mean, it was basically extrapolation of the old tank game, the old black and white tank game, but souped up and with digitized graphics. And I just thought it was a great concept, but never got released. And again, I'm sad about that. And then the third, after Spyro, I worked for a company called Equinox, and we worked on a console game. It would have been for like the Wii and the PS2. Uh, that was just again a great concept. It was called Sandman, and the main character was made of sand and literally could dissolve and move as a cloud of sand. So, if he needed to, he could fall through grating or go under a door, and just opened up a lot of possibilities. And I thought that game was really, had a lot of potential. But again, our funding ran out. We didn't get somebody to pick up the funding for it, and so that was never completed.
What were the most important people you met in your career?
Oh my God. Everybody. I really like, I just like meeting people, but certainly Tim Skelly was a huge honor, and to work with him, having had a career that he had, and Howie Rubin and Ron Waxman, who ran the department, and of course Jeff Lee and Dave Thiel, my collaborators for Q*bert, been fantastic influences on me, and just great to work with. At Williams, again, there's so many people. I mean, Ken Fidesna was our VP of engineering, but then we had George Petro, of course, Eugene Jarvis, my God, and Steve Ritchie was there at the time, and I got to know Steve, and Steve's an amazing, talented guy. What a guy. John Newcomer, Dennis Nordman, mostly, my collaborators, George Petro, Jack Hager, Mark Turmel, even though we never worked together, just Mark Turmel, and of course Ed Boon and John Tobias, who did Mortal Kombat. All of these guys, it's just great to be in the trenches with them.
Are you still in contact with the guys from the old times?
Well, yeah, more and more now, because of all this retro gaming nostalgia. A few years ago, I was invited out to the Galloping Ghost Arcade for what they called a NARC Developer Day. And a lot of the guys were there. And a lot of times I'll go to the retro gaming shows and run into them there. So yeah, it's been amazing to reconnect with them and to talk over the old times and relive some of the old stories. The thing is, I can only remember so much, but when I talk to the old gang, so much other stuff comes back to me. And that was all kind of instrumental when I decided to write my book, because I had this idea to write a book about all these stories that I was telling at the retro gaming shows, and collect them in one place. And I thought, how can I'm not going to remember enough stuff. And then just having conversations with all of these people just brought all the stuff back and made it very much real again.
You wrote books about Q*bert and the other games you were involved. Can you tell us what they're called and where it's possible to get them?
Sure. Yeah. So the story of the book, I self-published it originally. It was called You Can't Call It blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's why I did not read the title. Okay.
Well, that blah, blah, blah is the cartoon balloon.
Yeah.
And Q*bert. And that's a reference to a story in the book where Howie Rubin wanted to call Q*bert by that name, the cartoon balloon. And we were like, well, how do you pronounce it? And he's like, it doesn't matter. If this game is successful, people will find a way to talk about it. And we said, Howie, you're crazy. But he ended up putting it out on test with marquees that have the cartoon balloon as the name of the game. And so that's the title of the book. But then what happened was during the pandemic, where I had planned to go to retro gaming shows and bring the book and sell the book. It was available online, but I also was going to take it so I could sign it for people and meet people. And then it didn't, for a year, I couldn't do that because of the pandemic. And so I contacted some publishers to see if they might be interested. I really wasn't expecting any to be interested, but a really a publisher that I knew of. It's a small publishing house in California, right near me, but they were interested. and I was shocked and pleased. And so earlier this year, I signed a contract, and right now we are working to re-release the book. It'll be under a new title with a new cover, but it's essentially the same book, massaged just a little bit, and we're still working on that. And hopefully it will be available again in the fall, October, I'm hoping.
What are you doing today? Are you still in the gaming industry?
Only marginally. I do some consulting, and I have for a number of years. I've been consulting for Sony, working on various aspects of their gaming for PS4, and you know, not and a little, not so much for PS5 right now, but I'm still doing some consulting for Sony. Is pretty much what I do. I mean, I'm pretty close to being retired. I think I need to be retired soon.
But do you play the old games too still today? For example, Qbert.
When I go to shows, when I go to retro gaming shows, I'll spend a lot of time playing old games. But I have to say, I think I prefer pinball. I prefer playing the pinball games to playing the video games. I do play the video games, but I think I prefer pinball.
Do you own old hard and software at home?
I have 2 games at home. I don't have a lot of room to put games. I'd probably have more if I had room, but I have a Qbert, which, by the way, has the ROMs for faster, harder, more challenging Qbert. And I have a Terminator 2. And those are the only games that I own. I used to have a Lotto Fun, which is a redemption game that I did while on the side, kind of while working for Williams. I did it as a consultant for Howie Rubin. They gave me one of those, and I had it for years, but the cabinet was made of particle board, and it literally disintegrated in my garage.
Oh.
So all I have left are the monitor and the marquee and the electronics sitting in my garage. But the Qbert cabinet that I have is sort of an engineering sample, and it's a Frankenstein of different parts. And if anybody's interested, the arcade blogger, Tony Temple, on his website, did a feature on my Qbert cabinet. And you can sort of see pictures of it and look it up if you are of interest to see what I'm looking at it right now. It's right over here. Are you recording the video by any chance?
Yeah, on Skype, yes.
Here, let me see if I can get you to see it.
Okay.
Those are my cabinets right there. That's what I own.
Yeah, and the famous cartoon balloon is there too. Yeah. If someone wants to have more information about you and your work, is there a special place in the internet where we can have a look, or where you can have a look?
Yeah, sure. I created this website to sell my book, and even though the book isn't on sale yet, because it'll be available again soon, you can still go there, and it's called Warren Davis Shop, which is all one word, .square.site. And I post updates, so if anybody wants to keep track. I'm also on Twitter, and my handle is @WarrenDavis29. And I also have a Facebook page, but I have a personal Facebook page and a public Facebook page. So I usually don't accept friend requests from people who I don't know personally, but if you can find my public Facebook page, please like that, and that's a great way to keep in touch.
Yeah, then I have to thank you to go through your life with us, and it would be great if you could inform us if something special happened in the future with old games, for example. Thanks a lot, and yeah, good luck for your future and for next projects or for retiring, whatever you want. Thanks a lot, Mr. Davis.
Thank you, Patrick. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it.